Jesus, looking at him, loved him and said, "You lack one thing." In the name of God, creator and maker of all. Amen.
Amen.
In exactly 86 episodes airing on HBO between 1999 and 2007, The Sopranos, a crime drama following a New Jersey mobster, his family, his therapist, and his accomplices and rivals, earned a reputation as one of the greatest television series of all time, and was credited with beginning a new golden age of television drama. Now, I have a funny pattern with such cultural events. I'm typically a latecomer to popular television series, but if it connects for me, I focus like a laser, struggle to catch up, and then remain obsessively faithful. I first encountered The Sopranos while a seminarian and was stuck. I tend not to skip or fast forward through opening credits, ever, if I have my choice. And I always find the opening credits for this series oddly moving. Mobster Tony Soprano, the series protagonist, played by James Gandolfini, is driving home from New York City, and we see from his perspective the west end of the Lincoln Tunnel opening onto the New Jersey Turnpike. He then passes the Port of Newark, industrial smokestacks, the Pulaski Skyway, the Bayway Refinery. As the driver passes through Jersey City, we see from his perspective Italian butcher shops, pizza land. Apartment buildings yield slowly to small, modest homes, closely abutting, most of them built just after World War II, surrounded still by their original chain link fences. Eventually woods, eventually larger and fancier homes, an upscale suburb that looks exactly like Caldwell, New Jersey. The credits end with Tony arriving home at his French provincial McMansion on a cul-de-sac where he lives with his wife Carmela and two teens, Anthony Jr. and daughter Meadow. The credit sequence is effective because it shows you the arc of Tony's criminal but upwardly mobile adult life. His mother, his mobster uncles, still live in those modest houses closer into the urban core. Tony and his wife are what one friend of mine described as yuppie mobsters, coming of age in the early 1980s. Carmela loves Hermes scarves. She loves her Porsche Cayenne SUV. She loves Barbara Kingsolver novels. Tony's elderly mother, Livia, harangues her son for many reasons, beginning in episode 1 when she tells him not to use mesquite when he barbecues the traditional Italian sausage. It makes the sausage taste peculiar. Tony's Uncle Junior, a mob boss, runs his empire from his Jersey City living room. Cheap veneer paneling, shag carpet, and a plaid sofa. It has all looked the same since the Eagles' Hotel California album. "I've been sitting on this same sofa cushion for 40 years, he tells his nephew. This is one element of The Sopranos that in particular seems consistently and sharply insightful. The changing relationships between Americans and our material goods, the stuff of our lives. You'll be relieved to know that I am not an organized criminal. But watching Tony drive over to visit Uncle Junior had a way of putting me in mind of my own visits to my own aunts and uncles long ago. They're all dead now. But their frugality contrasted to my comparative fanciness, for lack of a better word. Their simplicity and apparent indifference to certain things contrasted to my own complexity and a gnawing feeling that relative to them, I was somehow compromised by my patterns of consumption and consumer tastes. Those themes are perhaps best worked through in The Sopranos, in the story of Carmela Soprano, as portrayed by the great Edie Falco. Carmela is an idealist, is thrilled that her daughter has been accepted to Columbia, always wants to do the right thing, recycles earnestly, yet cannot quite summon the strength to leave her mobster husband, who, in addition to being prone to violent outbursts, is also serially unfaithful to her. In season 3, she visits a therapist, Dr. Krakauer, who is as unyielding in some ways as the prophet Amos is this morning. Here's what Dr. Krakauer tells her, and here's how Carmela responds. Dr. Krakauer: you must trust your initial impulse and consider leaving him. You'll never be able to feel good about yourself, never be able to quell the feeling of guilt and shame that you talked about, as long as you're his accomplice. You're wrong about the accomplice part, says Carmela. Are you sure? So, responds Carmela, you think I need to define my boundaries more clearly and keep a certain distance, not internalize my, what did I just say? Leave him. Take only the children, what's left of them, and go. My priest said that I should try and work with him, help him to be a better man. How's that going? I would have to get a lawyer, find an apartment, arrange for child support. You're not listening. I'm not charging you because I won't take blood money. And you can't either. One thing you can never say that you've never been told. I see, replies Carmela. You're right. I see. Jesus, looking at him, loved him and said, you lack one thing. Carmela will continue tearfully to calculate the cost of leaving Tony, financially and emotionally, like the rich young man in Mark's gospel lesson this morning. She is compromised. Compromised. Just like me, perhaps just like you. Dr. Krakauer, like the unyielding Jesus we encounter today, loves her so far as he desires her flourishing in freedom. And like the Jesus we encounter today, he's not defaulting to the role of enabling comforter. Before him no creature is hidden, writes the anonymous author of the letter to the Hebrews. But we are all naked and laid bare. Jesus, looking at him, loved him and said, you lack one thing. Now, one possible and I think credible interpretation of this exchange between Jesus and the young man is that Jesus has recognized something particular in him, a pattern of compulsive attachments, a grounding of his own security and identity in possessions. This is a story about identity, materialism, meaning, and destiny. Remember the newly free Israelites wandering in the desert, nostalgic for the melons and the leeks and the cucumbers and the garlic and the meat upon which they feasted while enslaved. Jesus is telling the young man that God has new things in store for him, but his compulsive attachment to old things, material goods, is binding him. The young man, like Carmela, is unfree. Unfree. There's a fascinating book just out this summer called Triumph of the Yuppies: America, the 80s, and the Creation of an Unequal Nation. Personally, I found it a little disconcerting that a period I remember well is now being analyzed as history. But the book by author Tom McGrath, a Philadelphia-based journalist, tracks the maturing of a small but influential subset of the baby boom generation, tracks how patterns of work and child rearing and retailing and eating and church going changed in America as that generational cohort came of age. Tony and Carmela happened to be peers of this group, a reason perhaps that The Sopranos struck such a chord when it did. Author Tom McGrath, in analyzing those identified as yuppies during the 1980s, understands them at first as a natural extension of the on-campus counterculture of the 1960s, moving back into urban neighborhoods, embracing pesto and whole bean coffee were other ways of distinguishing yourself, McGrath writes, from your Jell-O mold-loving, meatloaf-eating suburban parents. In post-World War II America, McGrath submits, anyone could walk into a big city department store like Macy's or Marshall Field's. Lots of people were part of the tribe of Chevy owners. You consumed, in that generation, the World War II generation, he submits, to be part of something larger. In the 1980s, McGrath continues, something harder and colder began to emerge, with an obsessive new focus on product quality. The idea wasn't to show that you were part of the group, but that you were somehow smarter and superior to the group and to the generation before you. McGrath concludes that consumer choices during this period were no longer incidentals, but somehow became statements about the identity and the virtue of the purchaser. McGrath quotes columnist George Will, who wrote at the time, quote, "The point of owning Henkel's cutlery is that so many other people do not." Jesus, looking at him, loved him and said, "You lack one thing." Jesus, looking at him, recognized that the rich young man's possessions were far from the most interesting, commendable, and loving truth about him. Jesus saw that this young man was more than what he owned and wanted him to live freely, unencumbered, forgiven, loved, and freed. What are the most interesting, commendable, and loving truths about you? And what might be in the way of their glory showing forth.